In terms of mitigation, the first thing is energy efficiency gain. In building livable cities, we need to focus first and foremost on energy efficiency gains for all sorts of reasons, but one of which is economy. Singapore imports all of its energy source. So if you can reduce that, you benefit the economy. It's a double win because you also reduce your CO2 emissions. So energy efficiency gains first and foremost. Secondly, what alternative energy forms can you provide for the transport sector in particular? What we can see is as we go forward in time that electricity grid energy source is going to be the prime energy source for all cities going into the future. And looking at the transport sector is absolutely key to that. And again, there's a win-win situation here. The more walkable areas you have, the more cyclable areas you have, and the more areas where mass transit is provided instead of and better than car transport, then again you're saving on fuel. So those to me are the two most important things. The design of buildings is critical. So every new building that goes up should be net zero energy in its functioning. By net zero, I mean it'll put some energy onto the electricity grid for when it needs to take electricity back, and that gives you a net zero. But I think when you ask me about mitigation, I would also say, particularly for Singapore, but for all coastline cities, adaptation is also a necessity. Singapore needs to be casting forward in time to see what will be the situation by the end of the century. You have to look at different scenarios. It depends on global behavior. This isn't in the hands of the Singaporeans. Your sea level, our sea level, the global sea level is going to be rising. And it's rising because the oceans are warming and because ice is melting off land and going into the oceans. How vulnerable is Singapore to rising sea levels, and how do you manage that vulnerability? So in addition to mitigation, everyone has to look at adaptation as well. So the first thing is why would we need biofuels? And the answer to me is that while we can move all of our ground transport system onto the electricity grid using all sorts of mechanisms for doing that, we will never manage this, at least in the foreseeable future, for air transport. And we need air transport going forward. And so what we need is a substitute for kerosene, a high energy, high density fuel that can be used for air transport. How would you do that? My belief is that this is where biofuels can play a very important role. If you take first generation, then we're turning food into energy, and that is a very bad way forward. Second generation, turning cellulosic material rather than food material, protein and carbohydrate, into fuel. That's the right way forward, and that's what we call second generation biofuel. Now, I think that if you look at different ways of creating kerosene, this is at the moment the most promising route. Is it going to be a biological route? Almost certainly. By that I mean there is an alternative, which is a catalytic route based on the so-called Sasol process used in South Africa. They're converting solid material, coal, into liquid fuel. That's a very energy intensive process. You can use the same process to convert wood into liquid fuel, but again, it's relatively energy intensive. So I think it's much more likely to be a biological process, something that can convert the cellulose into a material that is more easily converted into liquid fuel. Singapore is one of the cities of the world that is constrained by its geography. And I think it's going to be absolutely critical for Singapore to be negotiating closely with its neighbours and with its near neighbours for just the reasons that you give. You have very constrained land space. The energy generation that you need is going to, for example, for your manufacturing sector, where's that energy generation going to come from? If you are going to continue to import fossil fuels, you're not going to meet the demand that we should defossilize our energy systems. If you have neighbors that have hydropower and spare hydropower, you need to be buying electricity from them. If you have neighbors that are producing energy, in my view, from nuclear energy, you need to be buying energy from them. So I think that there are limits placed on a country that is geographically limited as Singapore is. But Singapore knows these limits. Your entire livelihood is based on trade and on imports. And all I'm saying is that you need to look very closely at substituting imports of fossil fuels for imports of sustainable forms of energy. I don't believe that there's enough wind here to generate wind farms in the bay, in the ocean. I don't believe that there's sufficient solar energy for all of your energy requirements. And that's why I say I think that there's going to be a need to look at your neighbors as possible suppliers. There's no doubt that the way forward is to communicate best practice, exchange ideas. This is absolutely critical. So when we talk about communication, how do we communicate? We communicate in a modern way with e-communication, electronic communication. We communicate with hard copy communication, less and less, but journals and so on. But face-to-face communication is still unbeatable. It would be very good if we could jump forward into the future where we will all be sitting at large screens which have eye-to-eye contact, and I've used such screens which don't have a time delay on them, and where people from different parts of the world can all join in a conversation. But until that's more generally available, the prime means of communication is through conferences and getting the right people at the conference, just as we've had at this conference today.